The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1. By Helena Blavatsky. Preface. The author, or rather, the writer, deems it necessary to apologize for the protracted delay which has occurred in the appearance of this work. It has been occasioned by ill health and the sheer magnitude of the undertaking. Even the 2 volumes now issued do not complete the intended design, nor do they treat exhaustively of the subjects dealt with therein. A vast quantity of material has already been prepared, addressing the history of occultism as preserved in the lives of the great adepts of the Aryan race, and demonstrating the bearing of occult philosophy upon the conduct of life, both as it is and as it ought to be. Should the present volumes meet with a favorable reception, no effort will be spared to execute the design of the work in its entirety. This design, it must be added, was not in contemplation when the preparation of the work was first announced. As originally announced, it was intended that the Secret Doctrine should constitute an amended and enlarged version of Isis Unveiled. It was, however, soon discovered that the explanations which could be appended to those already submitted to the world, in the last named and other works dealing with esoteric science, were of such a nature as to require a different method of treatment, and consequently the present volumes do not contain, in all, 20 pages extracted from Isis Unveiled. The author does not deem it necessary to solicit the indulgence of her readers and critics for the numerous defects of literary style and the imperfect English which may be encountered in these pages. She is a foreigner, and her knowledge of the language was acquired late in life. The English tongue is employed because it offers the most widely diffused medium for conveying the truths which it had become her duty to place before the world. These truths are in no wise advanced as a revelation, nor does the author claim the status of a revealer of mystic lore, now disclosed for the first time in the world's history. For that which is contained in this work is to be found dispersed throughout thousands of volumes embodying the scriptures of the great Asiatic and early European religions, concealed beneath glyph and symbol, and hitherto left unregarded by reason of this veil. What is now attempted is to gather these ancient tenets together and to fashion from them one harmonious and unbroken whole. The sole advantage which the writer possesses over her predecessors is that she need not resort to personal speculations and theories. For this work is a partial exposition of what she herself has been taught by more advanced students, supplemented in a few details only by the results of her own study and observation. The publication of many of the facts herein stated has been rendered necessary by the wild and fanciful speculations in which many theosophists and students of mysticism have indulged during the last few years in their endeavor, as they imagined, to elaborate a complete system of thought from the few facts previously communicated to them. It is superfluous to explain that this book does not constitute the Secret Doctrine in its entirety, but rather a select number of fragments of its fundamental tenets, special attention being paid to certain facts which have been seized upon by various writers and distorted beyond all resemblance to the truth. But it is perhaps desirable to state unequivocally that the teachings, however fragmentary and incomplete, contained in these volumes, do not belong exclusively to the Hindu, the Zoroastrian, the Chaldean, or the Egyptian religion, nor to Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, or Christianity. The Secret Doctrine is the essence of all these. Sprung from it in their origins, the various religious schemes are now made to merge back into their primal element, out of which every mystery and dogma has grown, developed, and become materialized. It is highly probable that the book will be regarded by a large portion of the public as a romance of the wildest kind. For who has ever so much as heard of the Book of Zion? The writer, therefore, is fully prepared to assume all responsibility for that which is contained in this work, and even to confront the charge of having fabricated the entirety of it. That it possesses many shortcomings she is fully aware. All that she claims on its behalf is that, romantic as it may appear to many, its logical coherence and consistency entitle this new Genesis to rank, at any rate, on a level with the working hypotheses so freely accepted by modern science. Further, it claims consideration, not by reason of any appeal to dogmatic authority, but because it closely adheres to nature and conforms to the laws of uniformity and analogy. The aim of this work may be thus stated: to demonstrate that nature is not a fortuitous concurrence of atoms, and to assign to man his rightful station in the scheme of the universe, to rescue from degradation the archaic truths which form the basis of all religions, to disclose to some extent the fundamental unity from which they all emanate. Finally, to show that the occult aspect of nature has never been approached by the science of modern civilization. If this is in any measure accomplished, the writer is content. It has been written in the service of humanity, and by humanity and future generations it must be judged. Its author recognizes no inferior court of appeal. To abuse she is accustomed. With calumny she is daily acquainted. At slander she smiles in silent contempt. The law does not concern itself with trifles. Helena Blavatsky, London, October 1888. Introductory. Gently to hear, kindly to judge. Shakespeare. Since the appearance of theosophical literature in England, it has become customary to designate its teachings as esoteric Buddhism. And, this having become habitual, as an ancient proverb based on daily experience has it, error runs down an inclined plane, while truth must laboriously climb its way uphill. Ancient truisms are frequently the wisest. The human mind can scarcely remain entirely free from bias, and decisive opinions are often formulated before a thorough examination of a subject from all its aspects has been conducted. This is said with reference to the prevailing double error of restricting theosophy to Buddhism, and of confounding the tenets of the religious philosophy preached by Gautama, the Buddha, with the doctrines broadly outlined in esoteric Buddhism. Anything more erroneous than this could scarcely be conceived. It has provided our adversaries with an effective weapon against theosophy, because, as an eminent Pali scholar very pointedly expressed it, there was in the volume named neither esotericism nor Buddhism. The esoteric truths presented in Mr. Sinnott's work ceased to be esoteric from the moment they were made public. Nor did the book contain the religion of Buddha, but simply a few tenets from a hitherto concealed teaching, which are now explained and supplemented by many more in the present volumes. And even the latter, though disclosing many fundamental tenets from the secret doctrine of the East, raise but a small corner of the dark veil. For no one, not even the greatest living adept, would be permitted to, or could, even were he so disposed, disclose promiscuously to a mocking, incredulous world that which has been so effectively concealed from it for long eons and ages. Esoteric Buddhism was an excellent work with a highly unfortunate title, though it meant no more than does the title of this work, The Secret Doctrine. It proved unfortunate because people are ever accustomed to judge things by their appearance rather than by their significance, and because the error has now become so universal that even the majority of the fellows of the Theosophical Society have fallen victims to the same misconception. From the outset, however, protests were raised by Brahmins and others against the title, and, in justice to myself, I must add that esoteric Buddhism was presented to me as a completed volume, and that I was entirely unaware of the manner in which the author intended to spell the word Buddhism. This responsibility must be laid directly at the door of those who, having been the first to bring the subject to public attention, neglected to delineate the distinction between Buddhism, the religious system of ethics promulgated by the Lord Gautama, and so designated from his appellation of Buddha, the enlightened, and Buddhism, derived from Buddha, signifying wisdom or knowledge, the faculty of cognition, originating from the Sanskrit root bud, to know. We, the Theosophists of India, are ourselves the true transgressors in this regard, notwithstanding that, at the time, we exerted our utmost endeavors to rectify the error. To avert this deplorable misnomer would have been uncomplicated. It required merely an alteration in the orthography of the word, so that by common consensus it might be both pronounced and written as Buddhism, rather than Buddhism. Nor, indeed, is the latter term orthographically or phonetically correct, for in the English tongue it ought to be designated Buddhism, and its adherents Buddhists. This elucidation is of absolute necessity at the commencement of a treatise such as the present. The wisdom religion is the inheritance of all nations across the globe, notwithstanding the assertion advanced in esoteric Buddhism that, but 2 years prior, neither myself nor any other living European possessed an acquaintance with the very alphabet of this science, here for the first time presented in a systematic form, etc. This inaccuracy must inevitably have crept in through inadvertence. The present writer was fully cognizant of all that is disclosed in esoteric Buddhism, and indeed of far more, many years before it devolved upon her as a duty to impart a modest portion of the secret doctrine to 2 European gentlemen, one of whom was the author of esoteric Buddhism. And assuredly, the present writer possesses the unquestionable, though to her somewhat equivocal, privilege of being European by birth and education. Furthermore, a substantial portion of the philosophy expounded by Mr. Sinnett had been taught in America, even prior to the publication of Isis Unveiled, to 2 Europeans and to my colleague Colonel H.S. Alcott. Of the 3 preceptors whom the latter gentleman has had, the first was a Hungarian initiate, the second an Egyptian, and the third a Hindu. In accordance with the permission granted him, Colonel Alcott has disseminated portions of this teaching through various channels. If the other 2 have refrained from doing so, it is simply because they were not permitted, the hour for their public ministry having not yet arrived. For others, however, that hour has indeed struck, and the appearance of Mr. Sinnett's several engaging volumes stands as visible proof of this fact. Moreover, it is of paramount importance to bear in mind that no theosophical work derives the slightest additional value from any assumed authority. Adi or Adi Buddha, the One or the Primordial and Supreme Wisdom, is a term employed by Aryasanga in his esoteric treatises, and adopted today by all mystical northern Buddhists. It is a Sanskrit term, an appellation bestowed by the earliest Aryans upon the unknown deity, the designation Brahma being entirely absent from the Vedas and other archaic works. It signifies absolute wisdom, and Adibhuta is rendered by Fitz-Edward Hall as the primeval, uncreated cause of all. Eons of incalculable duration must have elapsed before the epithet of Buddha became sufficiently humanized, so to speak, to permit the application of the term to mortals, and to be ultimately appropriated by one whose peerless virtues and wisdom caused him to receive the title of the Buddha of unshakable wisdom. Bodha denotes the innate possession of divine intellect or comprehension. Buddha, the attainment thereof through personal exertion and merit, whilst Buddhi represents the faculty of cognition, the conduit through which divine knowledge accesses the ego, the discernment of good and evil, as well as the divine conscience, and the spiritual soul which serves as the vehicle of Atma. When Buddhi assimilates our egotism together with all its vikaras, Avalokiteshvara becomes manifest to us, and nirvana or mukti is attained, mukti being identical to nirvana, a liberation from the fetters of Maya or illusion. Bodhi is likewise the designation of a specific state of trance, termed samadhi, wherein the subject attains the zenith of spiritual knowledge. Unwise indeed are those who, in their blind and, in our epoch, anachronistic animosity toward Buddhism, and, by reaction toward Buddhism, reject its esoteric teachings, which are equally those of the Brahmins, solely because the appellation evokes what they, as monotheists, regard as pernicious doctrines. Unwise is the most fitting term to apply to their condition. For in this era of gross and illogical materialism, the esoteric philosophy alone is equipped to withstand the repeated assaults leveled against all that humanity holds most cherished and sacred in its inner spiritual life. The true philosopher, the seeker of esoteric wisdom, completely disregards personalities, dogmatic creeds, and sectarian religions. Furthermore, the esoteric philosophy reconciles all religious systems, divests each of its external human vestments, and demonstrates that the root of each is identical to that of every other major faith. It demonstrates the necessity of a divine absolute principle within nature. It no more denies the existence of deity than it denies that of the sun. Esoteric philosophy has never rejected God in nature, nor deity as the absolute and abstract ensign. It merely declines to accept any of the deities of the so-called monotheistic religions, gods fashioned by man in his own image and likeness, a blasphemous and lamentable caricature of the ever-unknowable. Furthermore, the records we intend to present to the reader encompass the esoteric tenets of the entire world since the dawn of humanity, wherein Buddhistic occultism occupies only its rightful place, and nothing more. Indeed, the secret portions of the Dan or Jana of Gautama's metaphysics, sublime though they may appear to one unversed in the tenets of the ancient wisdom religion, constitute but a minute fraction of the whole. The Hindu reformer restricted his public teachings to the purely moral and physiological aspects of the wisdom religion, focusing solely upon ethics and the human condition. Matters unseen and incorporeal, the mysteries of existence beyond our terrestrial sphere, the great teacher left entirely unaddressed in his public discourses, reserving the hidden truths for an elect circle of his arhats. These latter received their initiation at the celebrated Saptaparna cave near Mount Babhar. This cave, situated in Rajagraha, the ancient capital of Magadha, was the Cheta cave of Fa Hyen, as is correctly surmised by certain archaeologists. Time and human imagination swiftly compromised the purity and philosophy of these teachings once they were transplanted, during the course of proselytization, from the secret and sacred sanctuary of the Arhats into soils far less prepared for metaphysical conceptions than India, namely, when they were transferred to China, Japan, Siam, and Burma. The manner in which the pristine purity of these sublime revelations was treated may be observed by studying certain of the so-called esoteric Buddhist schools of antiquity in their modern guise, not only in China and other Buddhist nations generally, but even within a considerable number of Tibetan schools that have been abandoned to the custody of uninitiated lamas and Mongolian innovators. Thus, the reader is requested to bear in mind the highly significant distinction between Orthodox Buddhism, the public teachings of Gautama, the Buddha, and his esoteric Buddhism. His secret doctrine, however, differed in no respect from that of the initiated Brahmins of his epoch. The Buddha was a child of Aryan soil, a born Hindu, a Kshatriya, and a disciple of the twice-born, or Dvijas. His teachings, consequently, could not diverge from their doctrines, for the entirety of the Buddhist reform consisted merely in disclosing a portion of that which had been kept secret from all outside the consecrated circle of ascetics and temple initiates. Constrained by his solemn pledges, and thus unable to teach all that had been imparted to him, the Buddha, though teaching a philosophy erected upon the foundation of genuine esoteric knowledge, delivered to the world only its external, material framework, reserving its soul for his elect. Many Chinese scholars among Orientalists have heard of this soul doctrine. Yet none appear to have comprehended its true significance and import. That doctrine was preserved in secret, perhaps all too secretly, within the sanctuary. The obscurity shrouding its preeminent tenet and aspiration, nirvana, has so sorely vexed and provoked the curiosity of those scholars who have investigated it that, finding themselves incapable of resolving it logically and satisfactorily by untying its Gordian knot, they have summarily severed it by declaring that nirvana signifies absolute annihilation. Toward the close of the first quarter of the present century, a distinctive genre of literature emerged, the trajectory of which grew increasingly pronounced with each passing year. Ostensibly predicated upon the academic investigations of Sanskritists and Orientalists of diverse disciplines, it was deemed scientific. Hindu, Egyptian, and other ancient religions, mythologies, and emblems were compelled to surrender whatever significance the symbologist desired them to convey. Consequently, the crude external form was frequently proffered in lieu of the esoteric meaning. Treatises, highly notable for their ingenious deductions and speculative hypotheses, conceived in a vicious circle, wherein preconceived conclusions routinely usurped the place of premises in the syllogisms of numerous Sanskrit and Pali scholars, appeared in rapid succession, inundating libraries with dissertations concerning phallic and carnal worship rather than genuine symbology, each work standing in stark contradiction to the next. This, perhaps, constitutes the true reason why an outline of certain fundamental verities from the secret doctrine of the archaic ages is now permitted to emerge into the light, following long millennia of the most profound silence and secrecy. I speak advisedly of a few verities, for that which must remain unuttered could not be contained within 100 such volumes, nor could it be communicated to the contemporary generation of Sadducees. Yet even the modest portion now disclosed is preferable to absolute silence regarding these vital truths. The modern world, in its headlong impetus toward the unknown, which the physicist is all too prone to confound with the unknowable whenever a problem eludes his comprehension, is rapidly advancing upon a plane diametrically opposed to spirituality. It is transformed into a vast arena, a veritable valley of discord and perpetual strife, a necropolis wherein lie entombed the loftiest and most sacred aspirations of our spirit soul. With each succeeding generation, that soul becomes increasingly paralyzed and atrophied. The pleasant skeptics and sophisticated libertines of society, to whom Greeley alluded, care little for the resurrection of the defunct sciences of antiquity. However, there exists a significant minority of earnest seekers who are justly entitled to receive the few truths that may now be imparted to them, far more so now than a decade ago, when Isis Unveiled first appeared, or even when subsequent endeavors to elucidate the mysteries of esoteric science were published. One of the primary and perhaps most formidable objections to the accuracy and reliability of this entire treatise will concern the preliminary stanzas. By what means may the assertions contained therein be verified? Admittedly, while a significant portion of the Sanskrit, Chinese, and Mongolian works cited in these volumes is familiar to certain Orientalists, the primary text, the source from which these stanzas are drawn, is absent from European libraries. The Book of Zion remains entirely unknown to our philologists, or, at the very least, has never been encountered by them under its current appellation. This circumstance presents, admittedly, a substantial impediment to those who adhere to the methodologies of research dictated by orthodox science. Yet to disciples of occultism, and indeed to every genuine occultist, it will be of negligible consequence. The core tenets of these doctrines, however, lie dispersed throughout thousands of Sanskrit manuscripts, some of which have already been translated, albeit distorted in their interpretation, as is customary, while others still await translation. Consequently, every scholar possesses the means to verify the assertions advanced herein and to corroborate the majority of the citations. A few novel facts, unfamiliar solely to the uninitiated Orientalist, along with certain passages quoted from the commentaries, may prove difficult to trace. Furthermore, several of these teachings have hitherto been preserved through oral transmission alone. Yet even these are invariably alluded to within the virtually innumerable volumes of Brahmanical, Chinese, and Tibetan temple literature. Be that as it may, and whatever hostile criticism may await the author, one fact remains incontestable. The adherents of various esoteric schools, whose central seat lies beyond the Himalayas, and whose branches extend into China, Japan, India, Tibet, Syria, and even South America, assert that they possess the entirety of sacred and philosophical literature, both in manuscript and printed form. Indeed, every work ever committed to writing, in whatever tongue or script, since the inception of the scribal art, from ideographic hieroglyphs to the alphabet of Cadmus and the Devanagari. It has been persistently asserted that, ever since the destruction of the Alexandrian library, any work of such a nature as might guide the uninitiated to the eventual discovery and comprehension of the mysteries of the secret science has, through the concerted endeavors of the members of these brotherhoods, been diligently sought out. It is further affirmed by those possessing such knowledge that, upon discovery, all such volumes were destroyed, save for 3 copies of each, which were preserved and securely sequestered. In India, the final remnants of these invaluable manuscripts were secured and concealed during the reign of the Emperor Akbar. Professor Max Muller demonstrates that neither the bribes nor the menaces of Akbar could wrest the original text of the Vedas from the Brahmins, yet he nevertheless boasts that European Orientalists possess it. That Europe holds the complete text remains highly dubious, and the future may well harbor exceedingly unpleasant surprises for these Orientalists. It is maintained, furthermore, that every sacred volume of this nature, the text of which was insufficiently shrouded in symbolism or contained direct references to the ancient mysteries, was first meticulously transcribed into cryptographic characters designed to baffle the skills of the most accomplished paleographer, and subsequently destroyed to the very last copy. During the reign of Akbar, certain fanatical courtiers, displeased by the emperor's transgressive inquiries into the faiths of the infidels, actively assisted the Brahmins in concealing their manuscripts. Among these was Battaglione, who harbored an unconcealed aversion to Akbar's obsession with idolatrous religions. Battaglione, in his Montecabutita Warwick, writes, as they surpass other scholars in their treatises on ethics and on physical and theological sciences, attaining an elevated degree in their prescience, spiritual potency, and human perfection, they adduced proofs grounded in reason and testimony, and instilled their doctrines so resolutely that no man could henceforth instill a doubt in his majesty, even should mountains crumble to dust or the heavens rend asunder. His Majesty delighted in inquiries into the sects of these infidels, who are innumerable, so great is their multitude, and who possess an endless array of revealed scriptures. This work was preserved in secrecy and was not published until the reign of Jahangir. Moreover, in all the expansive and affluent lamaseries, There exist subterranean crypts and cavern libraries hewn from the living rock, wherever the Gonpa and Lokhang are situated in mountainous regions. Beyond the western Tsaidam, within the solitary passes of the Kunlun Mountains, several such sanctuaries are concealed. Along the ridge of the Altantaf, whose soil no European foot has hitherto trodden, there lies a certain hamlet sequestered within a deep gorge. It is a modest cluster of dwellings, a hamlet rather than a monastery, housing a humble temple, with a solitary aged lama, a hermit, residing nearby as its guardian. Pilgrims assert that the subterranean galleries and chambers beneath it preserve a collection of volumes so vast that, by all accounts, they would exceed the capacity of even the British Museum. According to the same tradition, the now desolate regions of the arid Darim Basin, a veritable wilderness in the heart of Turkestan, were, in days of old, adorned with flourishing and opulent cities. At present, only a few verdant oases mitigate this dread solitude. One such, carpeting the sepulchre of a vast city entombed beneath the arid sands of the desert, is claimed by no sovereign power, yet is frequently visited by Mongolians and Buddhists. Local tradition furthermore speaks of immense subterranean sanctuaries, of expansive corridors filled with tiles and cylinders. Whether this constitutes an idle rumor or an indisputable fact remains to be seen. Such assertions will, in all probability, elicit a skeptical smile. Yet, before the reader dismisses the veracity of these accounts, let him pause and contemplate several well-established facts. The collective endeavors of Orientalists, and particularly in recent years the labors of scholars of comparative philology and the science of religion, have demonstrated that an incalculable number of manuscripts, and even printed works historically documented to have existed, are no longer to be found. Indeed, they have vanished without leaving the slightest vestige behind. Had these been works of negligible import, they might, in the natural course of epochs, have been permitted to perish, and their very designations would have been erased from human memory. This, however, is not the case, for, as has now been verified, the majority of them contain the indispensable keys to texts still extant, which remain entirely incomprehensible to the greater portion of their readers in the absence of these supplementary volumes of commentary and elucidation. Such, for instance, are the works of Lao Tse, the predecessor of Confucius. He is reputed to have authored 930 treatises on ethics and religion, and 70 on magic, numbering 1,000 in total. His principal work, however, the Tao Te King, the core of his doctrine and the sacred scripture of the Tao Se, contains, as Stanislas Julian demonstrates, a mere 5,000 words, spanning scarcely a dozen pages. Yet Professor Max Muller observes that this text remains unintelligible without commentaries, necessitating that Monsieur Julian consult more than 60 commentators to complete his translation, the earliest of whom dates back no further than the year 163 BC. During the 4.5 centuries preceding this earliest known commentator, ample opportunity existed to obscure the authentic doctrine of Lao Tse from all save his initiated priesthood. The Japanese, among whom are today found the most erudite priests and adherents of Lao Tse, openly deride the errors and hypotheses of European sinologists. Furthermore, tradition asserts that the commentaries accessible to Western scholars are not the genuine esoteric records, but deliberate blinds, and that the authentic commentaries, along with nearly all the primary texts, have long since vanished from the sight of the uninitiated. Of the works of Confucius we read. If we turn to China, we find that the religion of Confucius is founded on the 5 King and the 4 Shu books, texts in themselves of considerable magnitude and accompanied by voluminous commentaries, without which even the most erudite scholars would not venture to fathom the depths of their sacred canon. Yet they have failed to fathom it, and this remains the grievance of the Confucianists themselves, as was lamented in 1881 by a highly learned member of that body residing in Paris. Should our scholars direct their attention to the ancient literature of the Semitic religions, to the scriptures of Chaldea, the elder sister and preceptor, if not the very fountainhead of the Mosaic Bible, which serves as the foundation and starting point of Christianity, what do they discover? To perpetuate the memory of the ancient religions of Babylon, to record the vast cycle of astronomical observations compiled by the Chaldean Magi, and to substantiate the tradition of their magnificent and preeminently esoteric literature, what now survives? Naught but a few fragments attributed to Berosus. These fragments, however, are virtually valueless, even as an indication of the nature of that which has perished, for they pass through the hands of His Reverence, the Bishop of Caesarea, that self-appointed censor and editor of the sacred annals of other faiths, and they undoubtedly bear to this day the unmistakable imprint of his highly dubious fidelity. For what, indeed, is the history of this treatise on the once majestic religion of Babylon? It was composed in Greek for Alexander the Great by Berosus, a priest of the Temple of Belus, compiled from the astronomical and chronological annals preserved by the priesthood of that temple, records spanning a period of 200,000 years, and is now lost to antiquity. In the 1st century BC, Alexander Polyhistor compiled a series of extracts from this work, which have likewise perished. Eusebius subsequently utilized these extracts in the composition of his Chronicon. The points of similarity, amounting almost to identity, between the Jewish and Chaldean scriptures rendered the latter exceedingly perilous to Eusebius in his capacity as defender and champion of the new faith, which had adopted the Hebrew scriptures and, alongside them, an untenable chronology. Furthermore, it is virtually certain that Eusebius did not spare the Egyptian synchronistic tables of Manetho. Indeed, Bunsen accuses him of mutilating history in a most unscrupulous manner, while Socrates, a historian of the 5th century, and Syncellus, vice-patriarch of Constantinople at the beginning of the 8th, denounce him as a most audacious and desperate forger. Is it probable, then, that he treated with greater leniency the Chaldean records, which already threatened the credibility of the newly adopted religion? Consequently, with the sole exception of these highly dubious fragments, the entirety of Chaldean sacred literature has vanished from the sight of the uninitiated as completely as the legendary Atlantis. A few details preserved from the Barosian history will be presented hereafter, and these may shed significant light upon the true origin of the fallen angels, personified by Bel and the dragon. Turning now to the most ancient monument of Aryan literature, the Rig Veda, the student, if he scrupulously adheres to the data provided by the Orientalists themselves, will discover that although the Rig Veda comprises a mere 10,580 verses, or 1,028 hymns, it remains imperfectly understood to this day, notwithstanding the Brahmanas and a vast corpus of glosses and commentaries. Why should this be? Evidently because the Brahmanas, the scholastic and oldest treatises expounding the primitive hymns, themselves require an interpretive key that Orientalists have failed to acquire. What, furthermore, do scholars assert regarding Buddhist literature? Do they possess it in its entirety? Assuredly not. Notwithstanding the 325 volumes of the Kanjur and Tanjur of the Northern Buddhists, each volume, we are informed, weighing between 4 and 5 pounds, virtually nothing is known of authentic Lamaism. Yet the sacred canon is reputed in the Sadharmalankara to contain 29,368,000 characters, or, excluding treatises and commentaries, 5 or 6 times the volume of material contained in the Christian Bible, which, as Professor Max Muller observes, possesses a mere 3,567,180 letters. Despite these 325 volumes, however, translators, rather than providing accurate renderings, have interspersed the texts with their own commentaries to validate the doctrines of their respective schools. Moreover, according to a tradition preserved by both the southern and northern schools of Buddhism, the sacred canon originally comprised 80,000 or 84,000 tracts, the majority of which have been lost, leaving a mere 6,000, as the professor informs his audience. Lost, as is customary, to European scholarship. Yet who can assert with certainty that they are similarly lost to the Buddhists and Brahmins themselves? Considering the profound reverence of Buddhists for every line written concerning the Buddha and the good law, the loss of nearly 76,000 tracts appears almost miraculous. Had the situation been reversed, anyone acquainted with the natural course of historical events would readily concede that, out of these 76,000, perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 treatises might have been destroyed during the periods of persecution within and emigration from India. Yet, as it is well established that the Buddhist arhats initiated their religious exodus for the purpose of propagating the new faith beyond Kashmir and the Himalayas as early as the year 300 before our era, and reached China in the year 61 AD when Kashyapa, at the invitation of the Emperor Ming-Ti, journeyed thither to acquaint the Son of Heaven with the tenets of Buddhism, it appears exceedingly strange to observe Orientalists speaking of such a loss as though it were indeed a plausible reality. They seem entirely unwilling to entertain, even momentarily, the possibility that these texts may be lost merely to the West and to themselves, or that the Asiatic peoples might possess the unparalleled audacity to withhold their most sacred records from the reach of foreigners, thereby refusing to surrender them to the profanation and misuse of races that deem themselves so vastly superior. Judging by the expressed regrets and numerous concessions of almost every Orientalist, the public may rest assured that students of ancient religions possess remarkably few data upon which to construct the definitive conclusions they so routinely formulate regarding archaic faiths. Moreover, this dearth of evidence in no wise deters them from dogmatizing. One would naturally surmise that, owing to the abundant records of Egyptian theogony and mysteries preserved in classical literature and by various ancient scribes, the rites and dogmas of pharaonic Egypt, at least, should be thoroughly comprehended, certainly to a far greater degree than the highly abstruse philosophies and pantheism of India, of whose religion and language Europe possessed scarcely any knowledge prior to the dawn of the 19th century. Along the banks of the Nile and across the expanse of the entire land, there stand to this day, exhumed yearly and daily, ever-fresh relics that eloquently recount their own history. Yet, such is not the case. The eminent Oxford philologist himself concedes this truth, observing, "We still behold the pyramids standing, and the ruins of temples and labyrinths, their walls covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions, and with the strange representations of gods and goddesses. On rolls of papyrus, which seem to defy the ravages of time, we possess even fragments of what may be termed the sacred books of the Egyptians. Yet, though much has been deciphered in the ancient records of this mysterious race, the mainspring of the religion of Egypt and the original intent of its ceremonial worship remain far from fully disclosed to us. Here, once more, the mysterious hieroglyphic documents endure, yet the keys by which alone they might be rendered intelligible have vanished. Indeed, so unfamiliar are our preeminent Egyptologists with the funerary rites of the Egyptians and the external indications of sex upon the mummies, that this ignorance has precipitated the most ludicrous errors. Merely a year or two ago, an error of this nature was brought to light at Balak, Cairo. The mummy of what had been deemed the consort of an insignificant pharaoh proved, owing to an inscription discovered upon an amulet suspended about its neck, to be none other than that of Sesostris, the most illustrious monarch of Egypt. Nevertheless, having ascertained that a natural affinity exists between language and religion, that a common Aryan religion existed prior to the dispersion of the Aryan race, a common Semitic religion prior to the separation of the Semitic race, and a common Turanian religion prior to the division of the Chinese and other tribes belonging to the Turanian category. Having, in truth, discerned merely 3 ancient nexuses of religion and 3 of language, and despite being as profoundly ignorant of those primitive faiths and tongues as he is of their origins, the professor does not hesitate to assert that a genuinely historical foundation for the scientific analysis of the world's principal religions has been established. A scientific methodology applied to a subject offers no guarantee of its historical veracity, and given such a dearth of available data, no philologist, regardless of his eminence, is justified in presenting his personal conjectures as historical facts. Indubitably, the distinguished Orientalist has demonstrated to the world's satisfaction, in accordance with the phonetic principles of Grimm's law, that Odin and Buddha are 2 entirely disparate figures, distinct from one another, and has established this scientific proof. When, however, he avails himself of the opportunity to assert in the same breath that Odin was venerated as the supreme deity during an era long anterior to the age of the Vedas and of Homer, he possesses not the slightest historical foundation for such a claim. Rather, he renders history and fact subservient to his own hypotheses, which, though they may appear highly scientific to fellow Orientalists, are nevertheless far wide of the mark of objective truth. The discordant theories of diverse eminent philologists and Orientalists, from Martin Haug to Professor Max Muller himself, regarding Vedic chronology, serve as manifest proof that such assertions lack any historical foundation, internal evidence proving frequently to be a misleading will-o'-the-wisp rather than a dependable beacon. Nor can the modern science of comparative mythology summon any superior argument to dismantle the contention of those erudite scholars who have maintained for the past century that fragments of a primeval revelation, bestowed upon the ancestors of the entirety of humankind, must have been preserved within the temples of Greece and Italy. For this is precisely what Eastern initiates and pundits have proclaimed to the world periodically. And while a prominent Sinhalese priest assured the author that it was common knowledge that the most vital treatises of the Buddhist sacred canon were sequestered in regions and locales inaccessible to European scholars, the late Swami Dayanand Sarasvati, the preeminent Sanskritist of his era in India, affirmed the identical fact to members of the Theosophical Society regarding ancient Brahmanical texts. Upon being informed that Professor Max Muller had declared to his lecture audiences that the theory of a primeval, preternatural revelation vouchsafed to the progenitors of the human race currently found very few adherents, the venerable and learned sage merely laughed. His response was highly suggestive. If Mr. Moksha Muller were a Brahmin, and did he accompany me, I might conduct him to a cave near Okemath in the Himalayas, where he would soon discover that what crossed the Kalapani from India to Europe were merely the fragments of discarded copies of certain passages from our sacred books. There was indeed a primeval revelation, and it persists to this day, nor shall it ever be lost to the world, but is destined to reappear, though the mletshas must, of course, wait. Interrogated further on this matter, he declined to say more. This transpired at Meerut in the year 1880. Undeniably, the deception practiced by the Brahmins upon Colonel Wilford and Sir William Jones during the preceding century in Calcutta was severe, yet it was thoroughly merited, and none bore greater responsibility for the affair than the missionaries and Colonel Wilford himself. The former, by the testimony of Sir William Jones himself, were so fatuous as to assert that the Hindus were already virtually Christian, on the grounds that their Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesha were none other than the Christian Trinity. It was a salutary lesson. It rendered Oriental scholars doubly circumspect. Yet, perchance, it also rendered some among them overly cautious, causing the pendulum of preconceived conclusions to swing excessively in the opposite direction. For that initial offering from the Brahmanical repository, yielded in response to the demands of Colonel Wilford, has engendered among Orientalists a palpable urge and perceived necessity to classify almost every archaic Sanskrit manuscript as sufficiently modern to afford missionaries ample justification to exploit the opportunity. That they pursue this course to the utmost limit of their intellectual capacities is evidenced by the preposterous efforts of late to demonstrate that the entire Puranic narrative concerning Krishna was plagiarized by the Brahmins from the Holy Bible. Nevertheless, the facts adduced by the Oxford professor in his lectures regarding those now celebrated interpolations, affected first to the advantage, and subsequently to the regret, of Colonel Wilford, do not in the least invalidate the conclusions at which any student of the secret doctrine must inevitably arrive. For, although research may demonstrate that neither the New nor even the Old Testament derived any elements from the more ancient faith of the Brahmins and Buddhists, it by no means follows that the Hebrews did not draw the entirety of their knowledge from the Chaldean records, which were subsequently mutilated by Eusebius. As for the Chaldeans, they undoubtedly acquired their primordial knowledge from the Brahmins, as Rawlinson demonstrates an undeniable Vedic influence within the early mythology of Babylon. And Colonel Vance Kennedy long since justly asserted that Babylonia was, from her very inception, the seat of Sanskrit and Brahmanical learning. Yet all such evidence must forfeit its significance when confronted with the latest hypothesis formulated by Professor Max Muller, the nature of which is universally known. The system of phonetic laws has currently assumed the role of a universal solvent, dissolving every identification and affinity between the deities of diverse nations. Thus, although the mother of Mercury was Maya, the mother of Gautama Buddha similarly Maya, and the mother of Jesus likewise Maya, nevertheless these three personages are deemed to have no connection, nor indeed can they possess any, since Bopp has established his authoritative code of phonetic laws. In their endeavors to gather the numerous threads of unwritten history, it is a presumptuous measure for our Orientalists to deny a priori everything that fails to harmonize with their particular conclusions. Thus, whilst new discoveries are daily brought to light revealing that sublime arts and sciences flourish deep within the abyss of time, the knowledge of letters is nonetheless denied to some of the most ancient civilizations, which are consequently stigmatized with barbarism rather than credited with culture. Nevertheless, vestiges of a vast civilization are still to be discerned, even within Central Asia. This civilization is undeniably prehistoric, and indeed, how can civilization exist devoid of some form of literature, or lacking annals and chronicles? Reason alone should suffice to supply the missing links in the history of vanished nations. The colossal and uninterrupted rampart of mountains which encloses the entire plateau of Tibet, extending from the upper reaches of the river Quan Ki to the Karakoram Hills, stood witness to a civilization spanning thousands of years, and must possess extraordinary secrets to impart to humanity. The eastern and central sectors of these regions, the Nanshan and the Altantag, were once adorned with metropolitan centers that might well have rivaled Babylon. An entire geological epoch has passed over the land since those cities perished, as is attested by the mounds of drifting sand and the barren, inanimate soil of the vast central plains of the Darim Basin. Only the peripheral territories are superficially known to the traveler. Yet within those sandy plateaus, water exists, and verdant oases flourish, whereon no European has ever ventured, nor trodden the now treacherous soil. Among these fertile oases, some remain utterly inaccessible even to the uninitiated native traveler. Though tempests may uproot the sands and sweep away entire plains, they are powerless to destroy that which lies beyond their reach. Constructed deep within the recesses of the earth, these subterranean repositories are secure, and since their portals are concealed, there is little apprehension of their discovery, even should vast armies invade the desert wastes where not a pool, not a bush, not a house is seen, and the mountain range forms a rugged screen round the parched flats of the dry desert. Yet there is no necessity to direct the reader across the wilderness, when equivalent testimonies of ancient civilization are to be found even in the relatively populous regions of the same territory. The oasis of Churchin, for example, situated approximately 4,000 feet above the level of the river Churchindaria, is now encircled in every direction by the ruins of archaic towns and cities. There, some 3,000 souls represent the vestiges of approximately 100 extinct nations and races, the very names of which remain unknown to modern ethnologists. An anthropologist would find it exceedingly difficult to classify, divide, and subdivide them, the more so as the respective descendants of these antediluvian races and tribes are themselves as ignorant of their ancestry as though they had descended from the moon. When interrogated regarding their origin, they reply that they are ignorant of the land whence their progenitors came, but have heard that their first or earliest ancestors were governed by the great genii of these deserts. This may be attributed to ignorance and superstition, yet, in light of the tenets of the secret doctrine, the response may well be grounded in primeval tradition. Only the tribe of Khorasan claims to have migrated from what is now designated as Afghanistan, long prior to the era of Alexander, offering legendary lore in corroboration of this assertion. The Russian explorer Colonel Przhevalsky discovered in close proximity to the oasis of Churchin the ruins of two immense cities, the older of which, according to local tradition, was destroyed 3,000 years ago by a heroic giant, and the other by the Mongolians in the 10th century of our era. The sites of these two cities are now covered, by reason of the shifting sands and desert winds, with a diverse assortment of relics, fragmented porcelain, domestic utensils, and human remains. The inhabitants frequently discover copper and gold coins, smelted silver ingots, diamonds and turquoises, and, most remarkably, fragments of glass. Furthermore, sarcophagi constructed of some incorruptible wood or material are found, within which lie beautifully preserved, embalmed bodies. The male mummies are invariably of extraordinary stature and robust frame, possessing long, undulating hair. A subterranean vault was discovered wherein 12 deceased men sat entombed. On another occasion, within a separate coffin, a young maiden was discovered by us. Her eyes were closed with golden discs, and her jaws secured by a golden circlet extending from beneath the chin to the crown of her head. Attired in a narrow woolen vestment, her bosom was adorned with golden stars, while her feet remained bare. To this, the celebrated traveler adds that throughout their journey along the river Churchin, they heard legends of 23 towns entombed ages ago by the drifting desert sands. A similar tradition prevails near Lobnor and within the oasis of Caria. The vestiges of such a civilization, alongside these and kindred traditions, justify our credence in other legendary lore, authenticated by educated and scholarly natives of India and Mongolia, who speak of vast libraries salvaged from the sands, together with diverse relics of ancient esoteric lore, all of which have been securely deposited. To recapitulate, do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.